Welcome to lesson 9, and in this lesson we're going to be looking at the basics of functions. Now, functions are an extremely useful feature when we're programming. They allow us to simplify our code. They can help us to reduce the amount of code that we need to write because we can reuse the function over and over again. That makes it easier to find bugs, and also it helps us when we change our code. It means that we're less likely to introduce errors. And the other great thing about functions is that once you've written a really good function, you can reuse it over and over again in different scripts. So I have some particular functions that I use for reading information from EEPROM chips. You don't need to worry about what they are at this point, but they basically are a little bit like a computer hard drive in a mini format, and I've written functions to get data from these and write data to them, and I just don't bother writing new functions anymore. I just copy and paste the same function over and over again because it works and I know it works. So functions can be extremely useful in your programming. So as we go through this lesson today, firstly we're going to look at the structure of a function, what it actually means to write one, how it should be set out. Then we're going to look at how we send information, variables, to a function. We're also going to learn how to get information back from our function. And then we're also going to look at how certain variables are exclusive to a function and how we can have a variable within a function that that cannot be used anywhere else. So that's the basics of the lesson that we're going to look at today. So let's get on with it and get straight into the IDE. Okay, so the IDE is running. Very simple script. You've seen all of this before in previous lessons. We've got an integer q, another integer, my answer. We've got an if statement while q is smaller than 1, and the idea is that I only want it to run once because, as we'll see later, q is going to increase in number, so next time round it just won't run what is inside the if statement. So inside the if statement I have nested a for loop. Let's just format this text a little bit better. That's it. So we've got a for loop, and within it my answer is going to be the value of q plus 3 minus 10 plus 22. Change those values to whatever you wanted, but I just wanted a little bit of maths in there to do something. And then once it's done that, whatever the answer is will print out, and then it'll wait 0.1 of a second and print out the next value. Now, to save you waiting for that to compile, because we've seen it all before, this is what happens. It prints out functions version 1 because that's what happens in the setup, and then as we can see it works through as if q was 0, then it's 1, so each time it's adding 1 to the value of our little bit of math until we've gone through 10 values, because we start at 0 and we've worked our way to 9 and we see the answers we would expect. So now what we're going to do is create our first function. So although we're going to create our first function, it won't be the first functions in our bit of code. We already have a function here for setup, and we have another function here for loop. Now we'll go through the structure of the setup of the function, and the function type we're going to begin with is the most simple one, which is void, and we'll call it first function. There we go, there's the structure. So void means we are not expecting a return value. Okay, so when this function runs, it's not going to send any data back to us. It's just going to process the code that runs within it. And that we see that with the setup and the loop. We never expect them to give us a value back. Now I'll explain a little bit more about the values we get back later. We then have the name of our function. Try and pick a name that makes sense to you. Then we've got a couple of brackets and then a pair of curly brackets, and the code for the function goes within these curly brackets. Now what we're going to do to keep things simple, I'm going to comment out this little bit of code here, and I'm just going to copy it into our function. Simple as that. So now we have some code. So when our function runs, it's going to give us exactly the same results as we saw over here. So let's compile it and see what we get. Hopefully it will compile quick. Okay, it's compiled, but I didn't get what I wanted. All it's done is written functions v1, which is what we had in the setup. So why hasn't our function done its stuff? Well, the reason is quite simple. Q, the loop is spinning round. Q has not increased in number, so it's going round and round in circles. But there's one thing we haven't done. We haven't called the function. And to call the function, we just need to call the name of the function. So all I'm going to do is put my function in there. Now when we compile it, we will get the result that we want. And there we go. The results are out. So what's happened now is that our if statement, Q was smaller than 1. Within the if statement was our first function. So at that point, our program now runs the code within first function. So it ran that code, which gave us those answers. Then it exited the function because it's finished doing what it had to do, and because Q had increased in value, the if statement won't run anymore, and that's the end of the little bit of code. So this example is an example of how you would clean up your code, because obviously we wouldn't have this commented section in here anymore. But it's a way of moving sections of code into their own functions, and very often this will make your code much easier to read and to find certain bits of code that do certain things. So for example, this first function we may be printing out to a LCD display or a touch screen or something like that. So we don't need a return value, we just need it to send some information out, and that's what it would do. So I'm now going to change my screens over and we're going to look at another type of function. So I've reset my screen to what it was at the beginning. We've got our original script with our if statement and our for loop. And now what we're going to do is write a different type of function where we return a value. So what we're going to do is create a function. Now you'll notice when I create a function, it must be outside of any other function. We can't write our function in the setup, we can't write it in the loop, and we cannot write it within any other function that we create. We can call it from any function, but we can't write it within another function. So this time we're going to call it, and it's going to be an integer type function, and we're going to call it int return function. And now what we're going to do within the brackets, we're going to write int incoming value. Okay, so there's our function now. Because it's got int at the beginning, int means it must return an int value. Okay, it's very important when you're writing your function to make sure that the result when the function is run, if it's not a void, it must return a value. Now what we're going to do to make this quite simple is we're going to take a little bit of mathematics that we had here, and we're going to repeat it up here. So what I'm going to do first though is I'm going to declare an integer, and we're going to call it my return value. Now, something about this integer and this integer value that you need to understand. Because they are declared within a function, they cannot be accessed from anywhere else in our program. So here, our integer q and our integer myAnswer, they are not declared within any particular function, so they are what we would call a global variable. I can alter them anywhere in my code, and I can access them anywhere in my code. But these variables, because they are declared within this function, only exist within this function, and once the function has run, they are destroyed. So if we had something where my return value increased in number, if we call this function again, unless we do some we use a special variable type which we're not going to cover at this point, that value will always start all over again. So what we're going to do now, let's copy our little bit of mathematics, and what we're going to do is paste it in here, and I'm going to say that I'm just going to copy this so I spell it correctly. So what we're going to do is my return value equals my incoming value plus 3 minus 10 plus 22. Heck, let's make it more interesting and go plus 100. Okay, now we'll at least know that we're doing something different. Now what we're going to do after this, obviously I have to return the value, and that's done by a very simple keyword. You'll never guess, it's called return. And if I put my return value as the return, whatever the value of my return value is, return will send it back to my program. Now if we look at what we've got here, we don't need this anymore because this is going to be dealt with within our program, and instead what we're going to do is my answer is going to equal, and now we call our function so there's our function, and what we need to do now is send it a value that is an integer, and of course we have a very suitable value. We're going to send it the value of q. So we're going to send q to our function, our function is then going to take the value of Q and it's going to call it now its incoming value. It's going to add and subtract various values from it, and when it's done that little bit of maths, it's going to take that value and it's going to return it to us, and my answer will be the value that is returned. And then what we're going to do is we're going to print out our answer just to make sure that all is well. So here we go. Oops, mistake. There we go. Didn't put the end of line in. It happens to us all. Let's try again. So there we go. Our values have returned. We've added 100, so we can see that it's actually working. We're getting the right answers plus 100. So as you can see now, from this simple bit of code, we've learnt to send a value to our function, and then we've been able to return a value to our function. Now, if you remember when we looked at using certain mathematics when we were doing division and we had to use a float, if you can imagine, if you absolutely hated that little bit of code but had something where you had to do lots and lots of calculations with floats, you could just send the value to a function, get it to do everything within it, change this to float and return a float value, and all that work would be done once. You wouldn't have to keep debugging it over and over again. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to add a little bit more to this code. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to save this. In fact, I should have saved that as functions version 2. Bad boy. And now we need to save it again as functions version 3. Because what we're going to do now is just add a tiny little bit of code. And what we're going to do in this one, we're going to send a value to a void function. So in our current script, we are sending our value to our function, which is sending us a value back. But we can send values to a void function. So we can send something to it, it just won't send anything back. So we're going to create a function up here, and we'll call it void print answer. And what we want it to have is an integer answer to print. Okay. And then within that, I'm going to take my serial print. I'm going to comment these out. I'm going to copy it up here. Do a nice little auto format. And now the answer to print we'll put in there. So now what we're going to do, we have a void function with an int being sent to it. So before we've had an int returned and we put an int into it. This time we're only putting an int into our bit of code. We'll take this, copy it down here into our loop. And what we're going to do now is print our answer, and the data that we're going to send it is our answer. It's an integer, so it'll have no problem going in there. So now anything that happens, and what I'm going to do, just so that we can we're just going to put my function printed answer just so that we can see that it is all working, and we'll very quickly run the sketch. So there we go. So what our code has now done is it has called the first function, it sent the value of q to the function, and it's got the result back after our little bit of mathematics has been done to it. Then we've taken that answer and we've sent it to our next function, which has printed out our information. Now what we could now do, let's just move that down a bit. We could now call this and give it another value. So let's imagine, we'll copy this, and I'm just going to paste it 3 times, and I'm just going to put a number in here. So 11111, 22222, 33333. So imagine we might have some other functions that are doing different things and we just want to know the answers to them. We can reuse this function, not just by sending that value to it, but any value that we want. There we go. What have we got? Not what we expected. What has gone wrong? 115, that's what we would expect. 116. Sorry, then we get the 111. Then we get the 222, and suddenly we get a value minus 32,203. What's gone wrong? Well, if you remember back to our data types, an int only doesn't go up to a value of 33,000. It stops at 32,000 and something. I can't remember the exact number right now. Let's quickly look it up in the reference. So an integer maximum number is 32,767. So because we put a value that is bigger than the int that it's able to deal with, it treats that value as it should do. If you remember our example of the digital car park, it's literally chopped the front off the car, and because it's overrun positively, it's now become a negative number. So just to fix this so that you can see how to sort it, we'll make the value lower. So there we go. Now we're getting the results as we would expect. But that issue with that other value is a very, very important thing. In fact, I think what we'll do is put it in underneath and leave it in the code for you. And just put in here exceeds the value for an int, so has overrun. Now that's an important little lesson to see, because again, when you create a function, it's important for you to understand what sort of size values you're expecting to get back. Because as you can see, if suddenly we put a value in that is bigger than the value of an integer, we will not get back in our code what we expected. So again, it's one of those lessons that we're relearning from an earlier lesson. So I hope that has explained the basics of functions. The good news is that by this lesson we've learnt most of the things that we need to learn to start building the robot car. So I'm going to start working on that next. I can't wait, to be honest. I'm a little bit fed up of just printing stuff to the serial port. I want to see some lights flash and some wheels turn. So we're going to get on with that next. But if we think about what has gone on in this lesson, we've learnt about the basics of a function. We now understand the structure of a function, how it's declared. We've learnt to send values to a function, and we've returned values from a function. And if you remember, we've also seen that certain variables within a function are declared within it and are not available anywhere else in our program. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thankfully now I can start to get on with building the robot car project. So bye for now.